Yung anong edad, nag-edad pa ako ng 14 anyos, na disgrasya po ako ng dinamita kasi maliit pa lang ako ng nagat na nagnangisda na. Hanggang ngayon ako nag-asawa na ng isda pero hindi illegal. Dito na kami ngayon nakalaga ng mga isda na tulong na bigay ng Taga-Nito Mining Corporation ng SDMP nila. Kaming lahat ng mga membro, lubusan nagpapasalamat sa kanila. Salamat sa pag-approve ng SDMP para tulong sa amin sa aming People's Organization Gamawa Gagmayng Mananagat sa Wangki. Salamat na bigyan kami ng SDMP na tinulungan kami ng kaming mga mangingisda na mabuo yung project naming Fish Cage Project at saka yung pins.
Ang gagmay mananagat sa Wangki or Gamawa po in English is small fishermen ng Barangay Wangki. So ito po ay isang grupo ng mangingisda dito sa Barangay Wangki. 20 po sila dito na ating tinulungan through the Social Development and Management Program ni Taga-Nito Mining Corporation. So binigyan po natin sila ng funding, ito, fish cage dito sa Barangay Wangki na meron na ngayong mga bangus at danggit.
Importante po na mabigyan sila ng pangkabuhayan dahil hindi man sila makatrabaho doon sa mining company kasi mamatatanda na sila. At saka isang ding goal ng TMC na magkaroon sila ng sustainable livelihood project. Pag na-turn over na namin ang project, hindi ibig sabihin na iwanan ng TMC. Tutulungan din namin sila sa simula hanggang pagkatapos sa pagbenta ng mga produkto nila, paglinkage sa mga marketing, at sa ibang pang mga problema darating sa kanilang livelihood. Kung sa pangingisda, siguro kailangan nilang pamboat, o nasira na yung fish net nila, o nasira na yung mga post nila, so doon kami papasok para namin sila matutulungan.
in 3, 2, 1.
Okay, sir. Live na po.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Magandang hapon po sa inyong lahat, wherever you are. Keep safe. Welcome to the 6th edition of a PPI webinar or online forum or seminar. This is in partnership with the Nickel Asia Corporation, which is very generous in supporting PPI. Since the start of the quarantine or lockdown, we've been doing a lot of online activities because we're not allowed to do physical gatherings. So, as I always say, this is the new normal. I hope everything gets back to a certain normalcy by next year, so that we can see each other, not virtually but physically, and also get to interact with that warmth that we're missing for so many months already. This is going to be a unique for all of us, because I think when we decided to do this, we thought that this is one topic that has to be demystified, or even a platform to debunk misconceptions or negative perceptions about the COVID-19 and a vaccine as well. And fittingly, we got two doctors who are going to share to us or enlighten us about the subject matter. Uh, we're very lucky to have with us a tandem, a husband and a wife, who will be, as I said, who will be doing a presentation, the discussion on a said topic on the things we need to know about vaccine and the vaccine trials, and also more importantly, what's really the role of media in terms of crisis of the pandemic. We're not saying that we will be challenged by another pandemic. I hope not, knock on wood, but I think that at this point, we've been preparing ourselves already for the worst to come, for any crisis, whether it's a pandemic or not, or otherwise. But I think what the point is, we are all a community of prepared citizens, so that whatever comes our way, sabi nga nila, we're more resilient than resilient itself. But I think we're never really prepared. But I think now's the best time to really equip ourselves with instruments and tools, so that whatever challenge that comes our way, we will be prepared um, to fight it or to battle it out. Let me just introduce to you our two resource persons. For the lady first, um, she is a community doctor and founder of Hope in Me Club, and that's Doc Tina, Alberto, Doc Ed, the better half. Baliktad na ngayon, no? Okay, Doc Ed, both of them are actually graduates of UPPGH. Doc Ed took a master also in hospital administration. Uh, he is a clinical trialist, has been a clinical trialist since 2006, has done 47 vaccine researches, clinical trials to date. He is also chair of the Institutional Research Ethics Review Board of RITM, co-chair of the Single Joint Research Ethics Review Board of the Department of Health. He is also secretary of the Philippine Health Research Ethics Network. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm so proud to bring to you, and we're featuring this time, as I said, two doctors, a husband and a wife. I present to you, my pleasure to present to you, Doc Tina, as popularly known Doc Tina, and Doc Ed. Please take it away, over to you. And okay, let me just greet our participants who are in the meeting room at the same time, who are watching us live via live streaming on FB. Please do post your queries on the comment section of the FB. And for those in the meeting room, you can use the chat room as well. So, ladies and gentlemen, Doc Ed and Doc Tina.
Thank you, Director Ariel Severino. Do you hear me? He's still there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, Doc.
Thank you for the generous introduction, Ariel, Director Ariel. First of all, I would like to thank the Philippine Press Institute under your leadership, Director Ariel, and good afternoon to all of that are here, especially the members of the media. For us, this is an opportunity to share what I know about clinical trial, especially to one of the very important members of our society, the media. Because for me, the media can make a lot of difference in giving out accurate information to the public, especially during this time of pandemic. So let me have my first slide. Can I have the next slide? May delay. All right. Am I on my slide too? Sorry.
Yes, Doc.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry if I have to start with this picture, I just want I want us to remember during the times just a few years ago when mothers are clamoring against a vaccine that was rolled out by our government. My intention is just for us to remember that time and be one in the endeavor that this should never happen again, especially now that we have a pandemic. Next slide, please. So, my intention is to share my knowledge to you about clinical trials. Because when we understand about clinical trials, we can be capacitated to have a more scientific appreciation of research information. Because we can always dream of a better reaction from the public when there's some public health issues, but we cannot blame them. They are just human beings who will act on what they think and how they feel. So we should understand this and take on every opportunity to share accurate information to them. We now have COVID-19 pandemic, and this is again a golden opportunity for us, the health practitioners and the media and even the government, working together in order to save the lives of the Filipinos. Next slide. If, if we understand clinical trial, it will protect us from falling victim to misinformation. And even bigger than that, next slide, it will prevent us from spreading the same. Because how you know now that it is very easy to share in social media. Sometimes whenever there's any news in the social media that or any information that sounds interesting, sensationalizing, anything that sounds controversial to post, people share it even without much thinking. We don't do this specially for scientific information, especially when it will impact the health behavior of those who will read it. Next slide. So, aside from this, if we understand clinical trial, we arrive at better decisions because we can differentiate opinion versus science. Example, opinion. Clinical trial is an experiment. Filipinos should not do clinical trials. This sounds right as an opinion, but what the science says? Science says every race may have unique reactions to a new vaccine due to genomic differences. Therefore, clinical trials will provide proof if a vaccine is safe and effective for the Filipinos. Since time immemorial, opinion and science has been arch enemies. They usually contradict each other. But the caution here is our decisions in terms of when there are scientific information, we should not base it on opinion. It should be based on science. Otherwise, the public health will suffer because it's not scientifically processed. This may be one of the reasons why we have some negative experience from the previous vaccine program of the government. Next slide. So, by understanding clinical trials, another important thing or another important step is for us to unlearn the learned misinformation that we already have. What are examples of this? One is Philippines or Filipinos should not conduct clinical trials. Another, it is best that we just use vaccines approved in other countries. So, just I have explained a while ago, there are genomic differences between different races and even ethnic differences. So therefore, we cannot just accept whatever was tested outside the Philippines and accept it as our new vaccine or our new medicine simply because we are not sure whether we will react the same way. So this kind of misinformation should be unlearned. Another example, that research data can be manipulated by researchers. I've been a researcher since 2006, and I could not imagine how I am going to do this. Because, the research design itself will prevent you from doing that. I will explain that later. Another, that all products with FDA approval means that the product is safe and effective. Uh, This gives us an idea because in Facebook you will find a lot of products, and sometimes the company will boast there in a very large image that the product is FDA approved. But please bear in mind that it doesn't mean that that product underwent clinical trial. There is a reason why FDA is labeling these products as no approved therapeutic claim. But ironically, if you hear or watch their advertisement, it has a lot of claims. So we should think twice about this type of products. Next, that clinical trials sponsored by pharmaceuticals are biased. This is another very common knowledge, but this is misinformation. You will see later on when I explain about clinical trials why this is not possible. Another, that any doctor can analyze research data or even interpret research data analysis. I'm a doctor and I'll be honest about you. Not all doctors are trained to do this. This is actually the expertise of biostatisticians and epidemiologists and also doctors who are really doing researches. So therefore, the message is not all doctors can have an accurate interpretation of research information. So be very careful when we try to interview what we call as experts, and then they try to interpret research analysis, etc. We should be interviewing doctors who are really expert on that field. So I now go to clinical trial itself. Next slide. So have some patience because this is kind of a lecture type part of my presentation. So a clinical trial, next slide, as defined by the good clinical practice by the International Council on Harmonization. The definition is that if you do research or investigation and you used human subjects to whatever scientific claim that you have, you want to know the effect on the body, you want to know how it will be absorbed, you want to know how it will be excreted, you want to know how it will be metabolized, or in general, safety and efficacy, and you used humans to prove this, that is clinical trial. That's the definition. So you will realize here that how important clinical trials are, because clinical trials will translate results of basic scientific research. Next slide, please. Clinical trials will translate results of basic scientific research into new or better ways to prevent, diagnose, or treat disease. There's no other scientific way of doing it. This is the only acceptable way of proving that a certain medicine or vaccine is safe and effective. It's the way to prove scientific theories regarding the efficacy and safety of drugs or vaccines for human use. Next slide. Now, this slide, I'm sharing this to you. This is the slide that is a permanent slide whenever I orient a new clinical trial staff who wants to be part of the team who conducts clinical trials. I always tell them our job is to conduct clinical trial as per good clinical practice, and our aim is to come up with a credible, accurate, and reliable data. And then I try to explain to them. You could just imagine how we will be partly responsible if we will not do this right. Because the products that will come out of this clinical trial will be used by the world or by different nations. Because usually clinical trials are multi-country. It's not just for one country or two countries. Usually it's a multi-country clinical trial that will be used by different countries. So it really has to be the clinical trial staff should be really be serious in doing clinical trial. Okay, next slide. My next slide is about the people and entities in vaccine clinical trial. You will see here, there's the sponsor in red, and then we have the green entities, and then the blue. The sponsor is the one who has the technology. They are the product owner. Can you click it, please? Next slide. Yeah. And then the sponsor is the one who, because of, for example, they are in a first world country and has all the facilities and the scientists to discover new technologies, just like now in COVID vaccine. There are new ways of making the vaccine, like mRNA, spike S protein, trimer tag technology. So they have proven in their laboratory that it can prevent COVID-19, for example. Now they want, and they have tested it on animals and it's proven okay and safe and effective. Now they have to try this on humans. So that is when they will have to find a research team who will agree to do the clinical trial on humans. Next slide. That is the green portion of these people and entities. They are called the study team. Okay, so I will explain this later on the roles of each of these entities. And then the third one, can you click the next slide? The third one is what you call the monitoring team. They're called the CRO or the CRA. Okay, so you will see here that this group of people are working together to conduct clinical trial, but they have their own independent jobs. They're working independently in order to make sure that the clinical trial data that will come out is really accurate and unbiased. Next slide. Okay. So for the sponsor, this is usually, I'll just talk about vaccine trials. These are companies, pharmaceutical companies, who, as I have said, are the owners of the technology. Now, they are the ones who are overall responsible for implementing and maintaining a quality assured system to ensure that the clinical trial is conducted and the data generated, documented, and reported in compliance with the protocol which they have agreed with the researcher. Usually, they're also the funding organization. Okay. So the sponsor would have to look for a researcher, usually a doctor or a scientist, who will agree with them to conduct the clinical trial. Next slide. This doctor is called the principal investigator. Okay. So this doctor or clinical investigator or principal investigator would have to study the product. It will have to research, it would have to study the investigator's brochure. Are you now on the principal investigator? The investigator brochures, she has or he has to check very carefully if the past data on this product, the laboratory data, the phase 1 data, phase 2 data are all um, good. The results are good. It seems that the vaccine is safe. The vaccine has some efficacy data already or effectivity data that it is now worth trying it in a phase 3 trial. Okay. So it's the doctor who is an individual who actually conducts a clinical investigation. And he will have to have a team to do it for him under his supervision. Next slide. And next slide is a co-investigator. This is another doctor or scientist who assists the principal investigator in providing oversight to the study team. So they share some responsibilities, but the overall is the principal investigator. And the co-investigator at times also performs the functions of a sub-investigator, which I will explain in the next slide. Next slide, please. Okay. The sub-investigator, this is the doctor who directly handles the clinical trial participants. So they're the ones who assesses the patients if they're eligible to be included in the study. They're the ones who assesses the patients, physical exam, taking care of them, and monitoring their health so that they would monitor if there would be any adverse reactions or adverse events to whatever investigational product that they are performing. So this is the study doctor. Next slide. Then we have the clinical research coordinator, which is the overall administrator. No? She takes care of the operations of the clinical trial. Next slide. Next slide are the staff nurses. So the staff nurses are composed of many. We have the site coordinator, which is the team lead if the team is further subdivided into smaller teams, site coordinator. Then we have the safety nurses, who are the nurses who day by day or week by week calls the patients, ask them how they are, do they have any adverse event, did they have fever, was the injection site painful, etc. Then we have the vaccinator, of course, who vaccinates, and the encoder, who are tasked to encode whatever information in the protocol should be encoded in the computer system so that it will be included in the analysis. Next slide. And then, of course, we have the medical technologists in the team. The site medtech is the one who extracts blood from the study participants. And we also have the laboratory or medtech coordinator who processes the blood or whatever samples that is needed to analyze the antibody response of the patients, will process it, will store it, and who will send it to a laboratory who will perform the laboratory examinations needed to prove the efficacy, immunogenicity of the vaccine that is under investigation. And then, lastly, for the clinical trial team, next slide, we have the field and office staff. So of course, because usually in vaccine trials, these are healthy patients. You get them from the community. So you need to have people who are trusted by the people in the community, and these are the field workers, usually barangay health workers. They help in identifying patients who might be interested to join the clinical trial. And then, of course, we have the transport staff, admin staff, and even an IT in order to help us in some computer troubleshooting. Next slide. Now, what is new is the clinical research organization. The clinical research organization is another third party which is contracted by the sponsor or the pharmaceutical company. They have to have a company that will monitor the clinical trial for them. They would have to check on the clinical team whether the study team is doing the clinical trial as per the agreed clinical trial protocol and if according to good clinical practice. And then their staff or their employee is what we call the CRAs or the clinical research associates. So they're the people of the CRO who's doing the direct monitoring of clinical trial activities. Next slide. Yeah. So next slide again. I'm experiencing some delays in the slides that I see. So I should be on the slide with an image of green and yellow. Yeah.
Yeah, yes,
So
green and yellow.
yeah, you can see here that these are the people and entities in clinical trial. The study team, the yellow, then the sponsor, and the CRA or monitor. So they are independently working on the conduct of clinical trial. And next slide, aside from this, 2 clicks please, you will see that there's another third party, the Independent Data Monitoring Committee. Yeah. This is another third party that should be contracted by the sponsor. And again, this is not part of the sponsor. This is a third party. Why? Because while the study is being conducted, there will already be preliminary data. Or at the end of the study, the data will have to be submitted to them for interpretation and analysis. So it's a third party where the sponsor is not involved in order to make sure that the sponsor will not have a hand in interpreting the data because naturally the sponsor would have bias because they want to prove the credibility of their product. They should not be the one to interpret the data. It's a third party called the Independent Data Monitoring Committee. Next slide. Yeah. So, and on top of all of this, as if it's not enough, that clinical trial design itself, especially for vaccine clinical trials in phase 3, it will have to be designed as double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trial. So this means that the clinical study team, the sponsor, and even the CRAs are not aware what vaccine was given to the patients. Is it the investigational product or is it the placebo? So there is no way for the study team not to report any adverse event because they don't even know what group did this occur. Is it from the placebo group or is it from the investigational group? So they don't have any reports. What I'm saying that the design of the trial itself will make it impossible to introduce bias into the research data, whether from the clinical study team, from the sponsor or CRO. Then everything will be submitted to the Independent Data Monitoring Committee. Next slide. So it has its own intrinsic mechanisms. So patient safety is ensured and data generation is accurate and unbiased. Next slide. Aside from this, so those are the intrinsic mechanisms. There's also extrinsic, In clinical trial, there's also what you call the Good Clinical Practice International Standard, number 2, right? This is authored by number 1. The Can you go back to the previous slide? The one with the table. Yeah. So the good clinical practice, this is the international standard being followed by all clinical trialists. So clinical trials should be conducted according to these principles. And this is authored by a conglomerate of countries who agreed that this should be the standard. We call it the International Council for Harmonization of Technical Requirements for Pharmaceuticals for Human Use, the ICH. Then locally, we also have the local guiding principles, which is authored by the number 4, the Philippine Health Research Ethics Board, and they came up with the national ethical guidelines, and the latest version is the 2017. And then number 3 is the local institutional review boards. And centrally, the DOH have what they call the single joint research ethics board, especially in big trials which will be conducted in multiple sites. It will have to be reviewed by the IRB and or the SJREB of the Department of Health. And then finally, no trial can be conducted if it will not undergo the review and approval of the Philippine Food and Drug Administration. So you can see here how stringent the controls are and the regulations are for clinical trials. Intrinsically and even extrinsically, there are a lot of parties involved to make sure that the product that will come out will be safe and effective for use and that the product was conducted according to international standards. Next slide. So how do we do clinical trials? Next slide, please. Another yeah. So you'll see here a picture, no? Because a clinical trial usually starts with community preparation. The clinical trialist should be responsible enough to inform the community of what we intend to do, what the clinical trial is all about. So we have meetings with the community. Next slide. Meeting with barangay officers. Next slide, please. And also, this is a picture of a big gathering of parents, which we did in one school, because we're trying to educate the community and the parents about clinical trials so that when we try to invite them to participate in clinical trial, they would understand what clinical trial is. Next slide, please. I'm already in slide 41. Yeah, that's the one I'm talking about. So it's a big meeting with the parents. Before you start clinical trial, you should be collaborating with the community. Next slide. This slide is very important. This is how we do clinical trial on a day-to-day basis, especially during the enrollment. So it starts with the parents who are interested to join, they come to the study site. So the one at the bottom, step one and step two, they go there to register, and we already give them the informed consent form or the information sheet about the trial for their personal reading. This is a very important step because the parents or the legally acceptable representatives should have a free time reading it on their own without any influence from any study staff, because we want to emphasize to them that if even at that stage with what they have read they don't feel like joining it, they are free to do so, to back out. That's a very important principle in good clinical practice. And only after reading it, they still find it interesting for them to join, then that's when they go to step three. Step three is the study overview. So this is the time when the study staff will explain to them a brief overview about the study. So this is now a facilitated discussion. And after this stage, if the parent is still interested to join, then she will proceed to step four. Step four is a one-on-one discussion with the doctor or the sub-investigator. Take note that it's one-on-one in an enclosed room. It can't be two parents, different parents at a time. It should be one-on-one. Why? Because we don't want the parent to be coerced or influenced by another parent, such that when one parent signs, she will also sign. So we try to avoid that by making the step four as a one-on-one discussion. This is also a principle in good clinical practice. And then, after discussing everything, she will undergo step five, which is ICF validation. So what does this mean? This means that even if we have explained it thoroughly, we are not satisfied still. We are not yet satisfied that the parents really understands it. So we have to ask them to answer a 10 to 12 item questionnaire about important aspects of the clinical trial. And they would have to answer that true or false. If they answer that correctly, most of the items, that's the only time we are convinced that the parent really understood what he is trying to get into. So that's the only time we will ask the parent to sign the informed consent form. So if you will notice, we did not get anything from the parent yet, not even their name, their address, or whatever, until they sign the ICF, because it is not ethical to get any information from the patients, not until they have signed the informed consent. Then after step six, step seven, that's the only time we get the demographic data, their vital signs, then the doctors examine them, do physical examination, medical history. Then step 9, the medtech will get blood to check. This blood usually is done during visit 1 to get the blood, because this is the blood without the vaccine yet. That's the baseline. And then step 10 is randomization. The computer will randomize the patient whether that patient should receive placebo or the investigational product. So it's blinded. We don't know what will be assigned to the patient. And then step 11 is the vaccination. You will notice that step 11 is boxed with interrupted lines. This is an illustration to you that the vaccination is a concealed area. No study staff can enter there or pick there, even not during vaccination. It's really an exclusive area for the vaccinator, because we want to maintain the blind. And even the vaccinator, even if she is there, she will not be able to differentiate the placebo from the investigational product, because it was designed to look the same in order to maintain the blind. So this is what I'm saying, that there's no way that researchers can manipulate data, because we don't even know which is which. And then step 12, after receiving the vaccine, the patients would have to wait for 30 minutes at least for post-vaccination observation. Then after that, we will explain the diary card, so that the parents will be instructed on how to record anything that they will observe. Will there be redness at the injection site? Will there be fever? Will there be pain, etc.? And then before they go home, we have to instruct them again when is the next visit. Next slide. Now, this next slide, just to show you the sequence, no? While doing the clinical trial, we have to write everything in the patient's medical record, and then the important information that is needed for data analysis will be encoded through data entry in the computer. And then there would be source data verification by the CRO, meaning they would have to check if what was encoded in the computer is really what is written in the patient's medical record. Until it is clean, it will be submitted to the sponsor for review again before it is submitted to the independent data monitoring committee, which I have explained to you in few slides back. Then there will be data analysis and then the report. Then this will be the one that will be submitted to the FDA for its review, whether it is worth licensing, whether it's the data shows safety and efficacy of the vaccine. Next slide. So right now, we are again to engage in clinical trials for COVID-19. Okay, so the trials now are soon to start. Next slide, please. And the Department of Health will soon again roll out a COVID-19 vaccination program. You could just imagine if again, during this clinical trial, there's a death, the public reaction would again be, there's a death and it was caused by the vaccine. But you know, in clinical trials, it's not, the processing of that kind of information is not like that. No, we don't jump right away to conclusion, because in clinical trials, once you sign the ICF and the patient, for example, goes to the store across the street and was hit by a vehicle, that will already be recorded as an adverse event. And it will be recorded as there's a death, but actually it was a vehicular accident. So just like what happened in Dingbaksha, there were 4 deaths. Actually, the deaths, all those 4, the 3 are vehicular accidents and 1 is a mauling incident. So, but when you read, clinical trial data, what you will see there is 4 deaths, but it doesn't mean that the deaths was because of the vaccine. So this is an example of how people might interpret clinical research information by jumping into conclusion, which is the one that we're trying to avoid. So the health professionals and media should help us in this life-saving endeavor. Next slide. Next slide. So the next slide is just a summary of what happened in Dingbaksha. I will not anymore detail this, but our experience from Dingbaksha caused us loss of trust to vaccination. Started 2018, and this has caused us resurgence of polio and measles outbreak, right? So next slide. Because this happened because, next slide, the Philippines approach it differently compared to other countries. Next slide, please. Another click, please. Yeah, another one, please. So there had been researches, even foreign researches, about the Philippines when we reacted about what happened during the last rollout of vaccination program. They say that the controversy was so effective at spreading vaccine hesitancy in the Philippines. And then Dr. Abeya Singhe, the WHO representative to the Philippines, is saying that political motivations is as important to understanding the Dengbaksha controversy. The Dengbaksha pilot was decided implemented by the previous administration when governments changed. They are looking for issues that they can blame on previous governments, etc., etc. We all know about this. It's a politicized environment and it does not help. This is something that we should be preventing to happen again during this time of pandemic. And then the role of the mainstream and social media is very important. We should be helping in providing accurate information to the public so they will not react incorrectly and do misinterpretations of scientific information. We should, next slide. Next slide, please. I don't know if I'm the one who is hanging or the slide. Next slide. Yeah, another one, please. Another one, please. I'm nearing the end of my presentation. Next slide, please. I'm now, yeah. So should always understand that Filipinos are highly emotional, so we should be very careful when we share them any information that might be misinterpreted. We should be clear and honest about any information that we know, and that we should have a way of communicating important information to them that is understandable to them in the language that they understand. Because if we don't manage this uh, responsibly, the undeniable complication of misinformation can lead to a failed public health program again and vaccine hesitancy. Next slide. Next slide, please. So this is just a study analysis that the role of social media nowadays is really a very big factor of spreading vaccine misinformation. Next slide. Another one, please. Next slide, please. Now, this slide is the research of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, just showing us that in 2015, our vaccine coverage is 93%. In 2018, it went down to 30%. And this is because of misinformation, which is the strongest enemy now in our era of social media. So our goal now is to have herd immunity. Please forward the slide. Our goal now is to have herd immunity through vaccination. So we should help in this endeavor. We should be facing once the vaccine for COVID-19 is available. Next slide, please. Another one, please. About herd immunity. The one with the picture. Next slide. Yeah, I just want to explain about herd immunity. This is our goal. no? So what we want is the majority of us to receive the vaccine against COVID-19. This is called herd immunity. The blue ones on column B are the ones that are vaccinated. Even if you don't have, if there are people who will not be vaccinated, but they are just very few, even if you have an infected person, the red one, who mingles with them, the chances that he will transmit the infection is very minimal. The greatest that he could infect is just the two, which was not vaccinated, but he could not infect anymore those who are vaccinated. So this is what you call the herd immunity, which will protect every one of us, even if not all of us were vaccinated. Next slide. So we aim for a vaccinated world, which is a more productive world. Next slide, please. Yeah. Next slide. I just want to give last message that there is still hope. Next slide. I hope through this presentation I was able to share with you about clinical trial and have provided you with understanding about clinical trial, because I believe that the media champions can be our savior in this time of pandemic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doc Ed, for that enlightening and thought-provoking presentation as well. Very informative. Over to you, Doc Tina. There.
Hi, I'm here.
Okay.
Wait. We'll be
Okay.
sharing the same laptops. I'll be sharing
Okay.
my own slides, so I don't
Yeah.
have to say have to go
Oh,
to say next slide all over again.
we'll be surprised if you don't. If you do it separately. Okay.
So, oops. Sorry, I'm not so techy. Okay. Uh, can you hear me now?
Yes. Loud and clear.
Okay, loud and clear. So, magandang hapon po sa ating lahat. So, before I begin, so before you give your reaction to the first lecture, I just want to put into context why we have to talk about vaccine trials during this COVID-19 pandemic. And also, let's put an emphasis on the role the media and medicine has been playing during the time of pandemic. So, not just this pandemics, but the pandemics of the past. So, I sorry. Am I sharing my slide right now? Not yet.
I think in the hope is the yes, the first slide, the opening slide.
Okay. So, I'm the one controlling it. Can I want to have control of my slides. Okay. So, okay. So, can you, Sir Eric, can you still control the slide for me? I'm so new to this Google
Okay, Doc.
slide.
Okay, Doc.
Sorry, I'm so sorry. Yeah,
Okay.
okay, I'm so sorry. So, next slide, please. So again, we have to emphasize that the COVID-19 pandemic is not the first pandemic that the world experienced, and definitely and unfortunately, this wouldn't be the last pandemic. So are we sharing slides now?
Yep. Yes.
Yes, Doc.
Okay. And then secondly, we want to look into the role the media played during the past pandemics, because every time we talk about pandemics, we talk about the efforts of scientists and doctors in saving lives. But actually, the media did made a major role during the past response of the world to different pandemics. And of course, we also have to look into what is the media and medicine doing right now to mitigate the problems brought about by this pandemic, and of course, how can we further strengthen our partnership to prevent the next pandemic? So, I strongly believe, okay, next slide, please, that if we want to look into the future, we have to look into the past and to
Mhm.
apply the valuable lessons it can teach us. Hippocrates once said that foolish are the doctor who despises the knowledge acquired by the ancients. Um, can you please present the next slide, please? And of course, it is very important to emphasize the difference between science and opinion. And I think most of the mistakes we're seeing right now in our society, why the COVID-19 pandemic is happening, because we fail to acknowledge the lessons that science and history has taught us. Looking back into history, next slide please, we can see that there has been several pandemics that has been going on and had happened throughout the 500 years we've been writing history. So one of the greatest pandemics which happened and killed so many people is the smallpox pandemic, which happened during even before Christ and peaked during the 1500s when it reached Europe. And it killed 56 million people. Another pandemic that happened was the Spanish flu, which we are all familiar about because of its similarity with COVID-19. So as you can see throughout history, napakadami na pong pandemics na nangyayari. And yet, this is never taught in school. Even in medical schools, this is not taught. Why? Because we are very complacent of the present science and technology that we have, that we never thought that it can happen again in our century. Kaya di ba nakaka-disappoint despite the fact that pandemics has been going on for 500 years, and more than a million pandemics, we don't know how to be pandemic prepared. There is no such thing as pandemic preparedness around the world, even though it claimed millions and millions of lives already. So, next slide, please. According to Dr. Snowden, epidemic diseases are not random events that afflict societies capriciously and without warning. So I do believe in this, that pandemics, epidemics are not apolitical. On the contrary, every society produces its own abilities. To study epidemics is to understand that society's structure, its standard of living, and its political priorities. So why do pandemics happen? Next slide, please. According to many studies, pandemics outbreaks happen because they have linked to deforestation, climate change, loss of biodiversity, economic situations, and unequal resource distribution. So nakikita po natin, no, pandemic in itself, you cannot separate it from the societal uh, the society, no, the present economic situation of the of the society. For example, the bubonic plague started in Europe because the rich did not look into the poor living condition of the poor. So yun po yung nangyari, di ba? And the Ebola had an outbreak in Africa, but none of the world was knowledgeable about it until it hit America, and that's only the time when we took into consideration and made actions to help the Africans deal with the Ebola pandemic. So pandemics has its own politics. Okay? So looking into history and literature, next slide please, hindi po natin pwedeng sabihin na the media did not play a role in pandemics. During the past pandemics, it is said that media played four major roles. Number one, the media is a source of information and unfortunately also of misinformation. Number two, the media is an influence and public response to the outbreak. Number three, the media serves as a marketing platform. And number four, the media is a powerful brain to bring positivity to a scary time. So this is a uh, role that the people perceive the role of media is in pandemics. So let's look back into the pandemics of the past and look if media did play this role during those pandemics. So bakit po ba natin kailangan aralin yung history? Para makita rin po natin, are we faced again with this similar situation now that we are in the COVID-19 pandemic? Next slide, please. So as you can see, even during the smallpox pandemic, media did play a major role as a major source of information. Even during the 15th century, um, 15th century, there were already written codex detailing the events happening, why smallpox occurred, the society that afflicts, and of course there are also literature and mass media scriptures showing how we can possibly get rid of pandemic. So eventually, the written literature is written first by the Chinese reached Europe, and eventually it reached Dr. Jenner. So the European man, there is actually Dr. Jenner. He is the one who first invented the coined and actually invented the first vaccine against smallpox. Unfortunately, in 1576, Dr. Jenner was able to discover the smallpox vaccine, which came from cowpox of the cows, and the world celebrated its discovery. But then when the smallpox vaccine was actually invented, we were expecting that the world will accept it agad, diba? But not literally so. So let us see what the media did during the first time that the vaccine went public. So next slide, please. So again, we will find ourselves what is happening right now actually happened before 200 years ago, and we find ourselves in the same situation that the people of 200 years ago also found themselves in. So during the 1500s, there were actually publications already against anti-vaccine. So when vaccines were born, its counterpart, the anti-vaccine, also came out. So this is a publication that was written by the Anti-Vaccine Publication Society in Europe. And as you can see, there were several misinformation that they were giving out to the public, saying that if you get yourself vaccinated by smallpox vaccine, which is actually came from cow, natutubuan ka raw ng mga parts ng cows. You can grow bottoms of the cows, you can grow tails of cows, and children can develop attitudes of cows. And this is actually what is still happening right now. And then next slide, please. Next slide, please. And it is also important. Next slide. Next slide. Excuse me. Okay. So it is also during that time, these were other written articles against vaccination. And mind you, of course, we have to remind everyone that this actually were based on opinions but not on scientific evidence why they refused to get themselves vaccinated. One of the opinions there that was given by the church that using animal infection is against God's will, and therefore we should not get ourselves or our children vaccinated. Another another opinion back then was that the inoculators, that's what we call the early healers from smallpox, were telling that they cannot support vaccination because they have a conflict of interest with vaccinators. And of course, back then also the medical scientists or the royal societies refused to write down or to publish generous ideas because there's a lot of opposition in the scientific community. So kung titingnan po natin, everything that has happened before is again happening now. Okay, next slide, please. And these were other publications back then or literatures during the smallpox era. So again, smallpox vaccine back then was already met by several opinions against this, and these were widely publicized. Kaya I think it took 200 years for vaccine to, uh, I think you're way past, to, it took 200 years para ma-eradicate natin ng smallpox from the world. The smallpox vaccine was invented in 1796, and we got rid of smallpox only in 1978. So again, pero let's also look back at the role of the media promoting vaccination during that time. Um, During the time of Jenner, there were also pro-vaccine journals that published the works of Jenner, and of course, through education of the people and the through the support of the government, they were able to vaccinate a lot of people and eventually get rid of the smallpox epidemic on after 200 years. Okay, so again, let's look into another pandemic, which is a more popular one. And this is the Spanish flu pandemic. So this article was written in the Washington Post by Dr. Thomas Ewing, who is a very popular historian on epidemics. And he wrote something and commented on the role of media during the pandemic of the Spanish flu. Okay, according to Dr. Ewing, actually the media did made a major role in in providing accurate information about influenza, uh, that led eventually to 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 its eradication. So it was the media first who undertook the messaging that it's important not to use masks, to wear masks, to socially distance themselves from one another. So again, the media did make a major role in informing the public ways to prevent themselves from getting sick from influenza virus. Next slide, please. But also during the early 1800s, may isa pang major role na pinlay ang media. So during this time, media messaging such as marketing were also already. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, next slide. So again, the scenario back then will mirror what is happening right now. So even back during the time of the Spanish flu, makikita ninyo na there were several ads claiming that their product is very effective against influenza. There were milk products, mask, even massage products and bar soaps that claimed to be effective against influenza. And these were all printed on your press or your journals. Okay, so again, nakita po natin no that the social media has been playing a very important role during the times of pandemic, but this is not we don't really recognize their role in these pandemics. Okay, next slide, please. Next slide. Next slide. Hello, sir. Okay, so the lessons we learned from the Spanish flu, according to Dr. Ewing, is that the media's coverage provided the masses ways to prevent the influenza outbreak from getting out of hand. But on the other hand, there were a lot of sensationalism also in the news instead of focusing on public um, public, what do you call this, reinforcing public trust in expert guidance. So that's what was lacking in the effort of the media back then. So looking at the role of media in public health, we have to realize that mass media plays an important role in the people's lives and in public health. The public health community and the policymakers often do not appreciate the importance and power of the media in shaping the health of the public. And also, the media organization do not see themselves as a part or of us contributing to the public health. Pero nakita po natin throughout history, history has proved us that the public health depends a lot on what the media is printing out or is informing the public about. Can you please, next slide, please? More importantly also, no, minsan po kasi when we look at the media, we will only look on media as a source of information. Pero actually, media po plays more role than informing the public. The media has the capacity to link public health and social problems to inequities in social arrangements rather than flaws in the individual. Media also has the capacity to change public policy rather than personal health behavior. Let me give you an example. For example, di ba sometimes we focus na why on the Philippines, a third world country, ang dami-dami pa rin namamatay sa pagtatayo or sa pneumonia. Sometimes we just see this as a person changing the personal health behavior, making them learn how to hand wash, pero hindi po natin nakikita na deaths happen in the poorest of the poor because there is no policy created by the government to create water, safe waste disposal, better water supply to poor communities. But the media has the capacity to bring attention to those problems and to change public policy rather than personal health behavior. The media also has the capacity to focus primarily on reaching opinion leaders and policymakers rather than only those people who have the problems. The media also has the capacity to work with groups to increase participation and to amplify voices rather than providing health behavior changes. In other words, the media has the power not only to reduce information gap but also the power gap in the society. Okay, but despite the knowledge or the fact that the media and the public health should be working together to be able to create a better society, there is always a tension existing among news reporters and scientists. And it is important to understand why there is a tension between the public health and the news media. This is an important book that was published in 1992 by the First Amendment Center, and this is entitled Worlds Apart: How the Distance Between Science and Journalism Threatens America's Future. This is a good book because it shows us how media and the scientists and doctors perceive one another. The book was written by Dr. Hartz, who is a scientist, and Dr. Rick Chappell, who is actually a journalist. It provides us a clear example of why media and scientists cannot work together sometimes. We cannot deliver a good message to the public. So, when we talk about the marriage of science and journalism, our dilemma is clear according to a journalist, Miss Cathy Sawyer. According to Cathy Sawyer, the most important gap between doctors and scientists is the language used. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay. So the language used, according to them, most doctors would speak in jargons that the media doesn't understand. And at the same time, media doesn't speak science. Okay. Another important difference between the media and the scientists are that our margin of error differs. Our concept of objectivity also differs. And science is also slow, while the media works in a fast pace and requires um, short and fast answers to give to the public. So those are the major gaps that exist between journalists and the media. So this book, which next slide, please. Okay. So this book chronicled not only opinions of key opinion leaders, but also made a survey of thousands of journalists and scientists to see what is really the gap between scientists and the media. That's why we don't communicate well with each other. According to the book, the gaps between science and media happens because scientists don't speak English and journalists don't speak science. And of course, there is also a gap between certain gatekeepers or editors who choose what is to be written in social media, and that there is also an observation that both scientists and journalists are likely to be egoistical and skeptical by nature. But again, looking back at all the science and history that we have seen, the authors conclude also that science and media should be able to reconcile their differences because there are common threats to our profession. Journalists with weakened credibility faces obsolescence in the fast-changing world of technology. Kaya po, di ba nakakapagtaka that sometimes we see YouTubers who have more followers, who have more views compared to valid social media or valid media. And of course, scientists also, system of language isolates them from the public at large, fear failure in the political idea. No matter how good your advocacy is, if you cannot present them to the public in an understandable way, you will likely fail because you will not be able to convince the public that your vaccine or whatever medical intervention you want is necessary and can benefit the public. So it is important that scientists and the media work together in order to create a good public health system. Okay, so despite the differences between scientists and the media, we have to remember that scientists and the media has common denominators and that we should work together in order to give a more reliable public information and to be able to create public policies that will benefit our nation. The research that was done by Dr. Chappell and Schwartz also showed us why scientists and the media are so different from each other. According to him, scientists have very little confidence in the press as a whole. And on the other hand, next slide, please. Journalists also have very um, differing opinion about the press itself. Ironically, next slide, please. Oh, this is very Ironically, the media also has a great distrust on the press and has a great deal of confidence more in the scientists rather than the press itself. So this is one of the irony that the survey done among American journalists and scientists showed. And most journalists would also complain that hindi nila makausap ang scientific community, kaya rin hindi nila maintindihan kung ano yung dapat i-explain sa public in terms of science, in
Yeah.
terms of uh, vaccination and other scientific stuff.
Mm.
And the next slide will tell you why most doctors do not speak to media.
Mhm.
Most doctors said, according to the research, next slide please, that they want to speak to the media, but they are hesitant to do so because 40% of them said that they are afraid of being embarrassed by their peers. So totoo po ito eh. So many doctors, especially during the past vaccine crisis in the Philippines, hindi niyo po sila mahahanap. And this is the most common media complaint, why nobody is explaining to the media
Mm.
what's happening about the program, what is happening about the vaccine, because precisely nobody wants to talk about it because they are embarrassed about criticisms from their colleagues.
Mm.
Okay? So another common agreement with various negative statements about the use of media coming from the scientists is that scientists perceive that the media has no understanding of science, and that the media has also more interested in sales, what is trendy, what is sensational. Yeah, most scientists do not want to speak to the media. I don't know if this is true in the Philippines, but I think this is also shared by many doctors regarding the sentiment it has against the media. The media, on the other hand, also concurred with the opinion of the doctors that they do understand that they lack understanding of science. And they did agree also that most media outlets are more interested in sales than science. So that's the problem right now. So, if you can see actually compatible ang sagot ng scientists and journalists, why we are worlds apart, why scientists and the media are worlds apart, why we cannot understand each other. But the good thing about the research, next slide please, is that a large majority of both scientists and journalists feel that there is no fundamental reason why the process cannot be changed. They see that the flaws that both scientists and the media has are just technical and repairable. So, ang recommendation from the research was that scientists and journalists should begin a dialogue to educate each other
Mhm.
about
Mhm.
ways in which of the public can be to summarize, ang kailangan po natin talaga constant dialogue that we, the people in medicine should also be media savvy. We should
Mhm.
undergo also on how to better communicate with the media and the public. And also the journalists should be trained also on scientific papers and on scientific interpretation of research para po magkaintindihan tayong dalawa. So, the primary goal of both the press and the public health professionals is to serve the public, and the communication of accurate information is a crucial factors in the service that we provide. So it is important that the public health professionals, the media should help each other and improve our service to the public by understanding and appreciating the perspectives and the needs of all parties. So I think it is important right now in the Philippines to do the same, because I think there is very less the relationship or partnerships between the media and the scientific community. And I think the relationship of the media should go beyond mere information dissemination, that the partnership between media and medicine can change national policies that can prepare us better for the next pandemic. So in the end po, before this is my parting message for both people in the media and the medical world, that both media and medicine are intrinsically good. And
Mhm.
despite all our flaws, failures, and mistakes, and despite criticisms against both our professions exist because we were born out of goodness and both share the same goal, and that is to know the truth and convey the truth for the good of humanity. And such, we should protect our profession and our rights to practice them, to have the right to look to the truth and the freedom to speak it, and we should work together to achieve the greatest goal of our professions. Maraming salamat po.
Wala.
Sorry ha, medyo hirap ako kasi hindi, hindi ko makita yung slides.
Sanay ka sa Zoom. Alam mo,
Oo,
wow.
medyo naguluhan ako.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mentioned about how enlightening the presentation of Doc Ed was. Now we begin to think about what Doc Tina said about all science and media. That should have a scientific community, and media should have constant dialogues, and that both are actually uh, in seeking for truth. No, let me just backtrack a bit. Now we are in the open forum. Hi, Dexter. Let me just shoot. Oh, guys, you should be ready with your questions. So if you haven't input or encode your question in the chat room, let me just throw in the first question. Backtrack a bit to Doc Ed's presentation. You mentioned about uh, sponsors are usually pharmaceuticals, right? Doc Ed, but can a government be a sponsor too?
The government can be a sponsor
Uh,
too if the research is government mandated also. I mean,
okay.
the research came from a government agency, like for example in the Philippines, PCHRD.
Okay, having mentioned about that in the Philippines, are we on the track of having a government-sponsored clinical trial or tests?
Uh, our researchers now in the government is not about clinical trials on vaccines, because we do not have yet technology
The
on
capacity.
vaccine type researches, but we do have a lot of researches, clinical trials of other things like medications, but not yet vaccine, because we don't have yet a vaccine manufacturing facility in the Philippines.
Mm. So, okay. On that note, we're looking at which country that we're relying on. Is there a specific country we're relying in terms of, okay, are we looking at, let's say, USA or France or Russia or China for that matter for, some clinical or trial tests?
You mean, are we trying to tap these countries so that we
Yeah,
could have
yeah,
our own technology?
yeah. Short of saying yes, or
Yes.
dependent on the outcomes of their trials or clinical tests?
Yes, we are trying to collaborate with these countries who are used already or they have the technology about
Mhm.
vaccines, like for the COVID-19 vaccine. There are a lot of actually collaborations already from the DOST, from the Department of Foreign Affairs, because I also attend meetings about that.
Uh,
And there's a lot of activities, a lot of efforts by the government to
with other
collaborate with these countries.
with other countries. So meaning it can be multi-country ang
Yes.
collaboration. Okay, it doesn't have to be like one specific country.
No, no.
Okay,
Actually, the government's trying its best to collaborate with as many as possible, because we know that there will be a limited supply of COVID-19, because there's only a few compared to the global population who's manufacturing the vaccine.
oh yeah, that's very interesting. Okay, to Doc Tina, you mentioned about it's a big, huge challenge uh, uh, for doctors like you, people in the scientific community, to bring back public trust. Remember, you mentioned about the Baksha controversy, and that there's now fear of not having to be vaccinated, especially kids or their children, right? So we've been experiencing the same thing for media. I mean, the public trust, wanting public trust on media credibility, etc. So the challenge for you now, what's the challenge for you now in terms of bringing back the trust and confidence of the public?
Actually, sabi nga natin, di ba, parang anti-vaxxers, misinformation has always been the parang twin sister. We were born out. Like,
Mm-mm.
the same thing for press, di ba? We have
Mm-mm.
credible press and we have, of course, misinformation going around medias right now. And I think it's the same. Kaya nga we have the responsibility to educate people. That's why we're doing this, to educate people, to show them how important vaccine and other medical interventions are, because as always we always really fail to look into history why things has been happening all over again. Di ba, tingnan nyo nga po yung smallpox, ang dami nang namatay, and yet
Mm-mm.
it took 200 years to be eradicated kasi people mistrusted the vaccines. And I think it's, despite the fact that we want sana every people to agree to vaccinate, it's also their right to refuse it. Kaya
Confused,
nga, our
yes.
goal is always to educate people
Right.
and to give them the right form of information.
Ano, no, ang hirap ng sitwasyon natin, ano? Because
Oo.
for a lot of people, this is the first time unprecedented, as we always say, in their lifetime na merong pandemic na ganito. So you brought us back to history, yung mga Spanish influenza, etc. That took lives, 15 million lives, right? Okay, let me just okay, open the floor for questions from our audience, whether those watching via live streaming on FB and those in the meeting room. I will allow you to unmute yourself so that you can ask the question yourself. But please take note, please mind that we only have very limited time for any question for that man, so we can accommodate the others. So kindly shorten your question, be specific to maximize time. Okay, anybody in the audience, in the meeting room? Dexter, I'm seeing you, Dexter. Do you have a question for our two doctors here? Anybody? Just unmute yourselves and just throw your questions out for Doc Tina, either Doc Tina or Doc Ed. Dexter, I can surmise you have a question. Unmute yourself. Unmute yourselves. Or unmute yourself, Dexter. Okay. Anybody in the meeting room? Okay, there you go, Dexter. I'm seeing you. Okay. Question? Unmute yourself so that you can ask the question yourself. You don't have to key in your question in the chat room. Use your voice.
Medyo
Okay.
nadi-disorient yata. Ako na-disorient ako sobra.
Kasi hindi nasanay sa Google Meet.
Yes, I was
Oo.
looking at my cell phone and looking at the laptop,
Oo.
and
Yeah,
so
yeah.
many thoughts were lost in between. Parang alam mo yun, parang I wish I can redo it again because
No, it's okay.
okay.
Very insightful. I thought na lahat naman na covered all levels and all fields.
And of course, we have the limited time because
Oo.
the
Yeah.
first discussion was really long and we
Oo.
have to move
Here,
fast.
do we have some comments and questions from our participants watching via live streaming?
I'm checking
Risa?
now. I'm checking
Okay.
now.
Okay? Uh, hindi ako naririnig ni Dexter. Dexter?
Si- Siguro on my part, I want just to emphasize that talaga the media is not just a source of information.
Mm-mm.
Actually, that's the main that's the main message of the presentation, that the media has been playing a great role in in preventing pandemics, in stopping pandemics.
Mm-mm.
And we could further that role and strengthen the relationship between media and medicine para
Mm-mm.
at least we will be able to prevent the next pandemic. Kasi media has the power to bring new policies, to focus on problems, okay? To pressure the government to
Mm-mm.
take some actions.
Mm-mm.
Kasi we doctors, we're generally shy.
Yeah. Yung, Doc Tina, while we wait for the queries
Yes.
and comments from our audience, you mentioned about constant dialogue should have a constant dialogue for all, no, for all sectors. Sa tingin mo at this point na the public is just waiting for uh, the vaccine or a cure for the virus. Ano yung kailangan gawin na masasabi natin na we just comfort ourselves into, let's say, thinking na there's hope and that not anytime soon, but ito yung kailangan gawin na at this point na
And
habang naghihintay tayo.
Sir Ariel.
Yeah,
Okay.
Mr. Dexter is in.
Dexter, okay, stand by. Meron pang sagot si Doc Tina. And then you.
Okay. While waiting for the COVID-19 vaccine, we have to educate already the masses. Now, once the vaccine comes out, I as a doctor will tell you now, we don't guarantee it will work agad. It will really be effective in eradicating the disease. And it could, if that happens, there we can get another negative reactions, because in the field of medicine talaga there is nothing definite eh. Like, kaya nga sometimes iba, they said doctors speak a different language from journalists. Like, if you ask us, is this effective? Ang sasagot namin yan, there are no clinical trials yet showing blah 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 blah. And that in itself, hindi yan acceptable na sagot sa tao eh. Sometimes people want definite answers. So we have to educate them that the vaccine is just one part of the solution. And we have also to orient them that vaccines are not 100% perfect. Okay, and that should not lead to vaccine hesitancy or mistrust in the scientific community. Siguro that's what we have to do, to educate people what health interventions are, not just vaccines, even medicines or any medical interventions for that matter.
Very well. Okay, Dexter, it's your turn. Unmute yourself. Ikaw
Yeah,
na.
hello.
Okay,
Good
go.
afternoon. Yan. I would like to ask, because in the media, most of the time, we encounter conflicting remarks from experts. That's why it also adds to the confusion. Doc, how will you react to this?
Actually, totoo po yan eh, no? Kaya nga po,
Unmute.
kahit sabihin na, Doc, what's your opinion about this? Most doctors are hesitant precisely because alam namin may ibang doctor na magre-react differently. Remember po, when we talk about science, especially when it comes to the science of medicine, hindi po siya parang math na 1 plus 1 is equals 2. There will be varying answers to one question. Like if you ask me the question na, sasabihin ng iba, is this medication or medicine A effective for this illness B? Ang sasabihin ko, 50% of clinical trials show that it can be effective for this group of people. Pero hindi pala yun ang sinasubscribe ng another doctor. He read from another journal, he read from another society na iba yung opinion niya. Kaya minsan po, nagkakaiba kami ng opinion. Kaya we have to make the public understand na ang science ngayon, ang ating medical truths ngayon may be different after several years from now. Lalo na po pag may ibang ebidensya na lumalabas. For one classic example, yung aspirin dati, di ba? Marami po dyan. Sabi aspirin is good for fever, and then later on lumabas ang ebidensya that it can harm children, so we have to stop taking it. So as there are evidence going out against a certain medical intervention, we also have to change our statements regarding a particular medicine or a particular condition. Kaya po minsan depende kung ganong ka-advance yung isang doktor kumpara sa iba, nagbabago-bago din po yung medical opinions natin. Kaya nga there are different school of thoughts also when it comes to medicine.
Okay, Dexter. Okay.
Yes, follow up, Doc. So, where will we stay now? Our problem is how to reconcile your differing opinions. That's why sometimes our audience, our readers really are also confused on who to
To
believe
follow.
because of
Okay. Kaya po, I think my husband is more
so for
keen to answer that
what
question.
we do,
Sir
what will
Dexter.
scientists do?
Yeah. Sir
Yeah,
Dexter,
sir. Good
actually, I
afternoon.
think, yeah, one of the things that we have to improve on is recognizing who should be the authority source of information for specific issues.
Okay.
So if it will be health issues, we should recognize the authority of the Department of Health
Okay.
as the one who should have the official statements, official interpretation about health issues. Because surely there will always be one doctor, two doctors, few doctors who may have a differing opinion. And if we present them as both authorities, that's when we will have problems. So just like the International Authority for Health, the World Health Organization, we regard that as the International Authority for Health. And for the Philippines, I think we should try to give the official the credit to the Department of Health because they are the authority for the health of the country. That's my opinion for your question.
Okay. Dexter.
Thank you, Doc. Clear,
Okay,
clear. Yeah.
okay,
Thank you.
you're okay with that. So, okay ka na sa story ang gagawin mo. Okay, other questions please from the floor, from the virtual floor, whether in this meeting room or those watching live via streaming, FB streaming, meron? Here?
Sa live stream, sir, wala po.
Oh, wala pa. Okay. Okay, any more from our audience in the meeting room? Baka takot ng no, magtanong ano. Okay, wala na ba? Okay, Doc Tina and Doc Ed, you mentioned about speaking different language and that something to do with information also, probably misinformation, and that the public deserves truthful, verified, factual information at this point. Now there's so much confusion. And then you said na official sources, you should be relying on official sources, health issues, Department of Health, pag international scheme naman, World Health Organization. Yung mga hindi gaano nakakaintindi ng scientific term, etc. And I'm pretty sure it's really the job and function of the media to laymanize everything. Pero where do you stand in the scheme of things pag medyo nagkulang yung media in terms of, let's say, yung understandable information baga? Kasi syempre, iba yung lengguwahe namin. And really an effort for all of us in the media, for most of the journalists, especially pag hindi beat, tsaka hindi masyadong aral doon, but syempre hindi yan excuse, na talagang mag-effort para maintindihan ng publiko, especially ng masses, paano kayo papasok or ano yung intervention na pwede nyo maitulong baga? You mentioned about education kasi.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, yun nga actually, yung tanong mo kanina, what can we do now, no? Ang focus natin dapat ngayon talaga, communication, education. That's what we should focus on. Ngayon pa lang dapat nagkakaroon na tayo ng risk communication, education in the communities, and we should, eto nalilimutan, no? The very important role of social media now, di ba? Very important factor.
yeah.
Pero, walang nagmamanage niyan sa ngayon, no? There should be an authority or I don't know how the government will handle that. Pero pag ito na naman, meron na namang mga information sa social media na walang nagmamanage, yan na naman ang magpo-proliferate. And too late, we will not counter that with a good information campaign.
Correct, I agree. Very striking yung binanggit nyo kanina. I think was that Doc Ed, or both of you said that hindi masyadong scientific mag-isip yung mga Pinoy kasi we're very emotional. That's why we love teleserye and all. Mga melodramatic tayo baga. Pero walang excuse at this point na parang kailangan natin pag-aralan and that we cannot rely basically on the media, uh, sa mga journalists na merong pagkukulang din, and that I think ako, pag tinanong mo ako, I think this is about the good time na mag-effort din ang mga people in the scientific community na medyo ng konti mag-loosen up para mas ma-accommodate, mas relatable, mas accessible. That's the term.
True.
Oh.
Tama.
Actually, dun sa nakita yung recommendation they did in the US by the First Amendment Association, na dapat the scientific community should develop programs specifically for the media, parang scholarship programs to educate media on how science works and how or the scientific methods para mas nakakaintindihan tayo. At the same time, also yung mga doktor, dapat din daw mag-enroll sa media on how you speak and how you
May media
communicate with the
savvy,
public.
oo.
Oo, di ba, media savvy. At the same time also siguro, mas maging involved yung mga private doctors on public health campaigns at saka policy making. Kasi di ba pag doktor ka, I think, I don't know ha, pero ang concept ng mga Pilipino, pag doktor, you're just supposed to cure illness. But in terms of public health and policy making, parang wala ng role yung mga doctors when we should be taking that role specifically. Di ba? Parang ganun yung nangyayari. And I think the media also, I think ang mediator ng scientific people na hindi marunong magsalita sa public is the media talaga. Talagang you should be our greatest partner in health.
Mga spokesperson, parang pang gano'n, for the
Kasi kami,
message. Oo.
di ba? We find it difficult
Yeah.
difficult to speak to people. What's the best way? What's the best mode? What's the tailor-fitted approach to this particular population? Mas adapted ang media dyan mas alam nyo yan.
Yeah. It was a good point you raised about education. I really have to mention that because bago itong topic na to, bago itong webinar na to, we also talked about online education now and the challenges that teachers are facing in this pandemic, in this crisis, unprecedented. You mentioned about education. For all those watching, kasi halo-halong nanonood sa atin ngayon, meron media practitioners, meron academics, and it's a good thing that they're here in this platform na sama-sama tayo, multi-sectoral, andito tayo ngayon, nag-uusap, significant discourse. Anong pwedeng yung maging, let's say, message or sabihin na natin, challenge for the academics na nag-online classes ngayon and that, kids are just bombarded with too much information because technology is on hand, is just there. Paano? Anong pwedeng natin, paano papasok yung ganong yung edukasyon in terms of science, etc. Sabi nga ng isang kasama namin sa media, si Jing Reyes ng ABS-CBN, I think we're too over-entertained na kailangan natin maging over-informed, parang ganon. Oo. Di ba? Sige, Doc, anong pwede yung advice?
I think para kasi ang educational system
Because you have kids yourself. You have kids yourself.
Yung
diba?
educational system natin kasi is not too too scientific. Kung mapapansin mo, 'di ba, children are trained to memorize things but not to think outside of the box.
Critical thinking.
That's the way how the educational system right now, although they don't develop critical thinking primarily. As a scientist, dapat you have to have an open mind and you should be a critical thinker. And of course also the media, you just don't report on what you see, but you have to, 'di ba? To analyze what you're seeing and what you have to report. Siguro, we have to teach our children how to be critical thinkers, to think outside of the box, to go beyond entertainment. Kasi ang education ngayon parang nagiging entertainment. And to go back to studying more on science, to looking back into history kasi we keep on repeating the same mistakes. And to, ano pa ba?
Medyo challenging talaga yan.
Ito medyo technical to ng konti. Okay, para lang for our audience out there, and this is going to be also the recorded documentation can be watched via YouTube. Yung ang tawag nito, yung paano natin ngayon sasabihin, ipapaintindi na merong clinical trial, merong clinical test, pero maghihintay pa ng ilang, how exactly, yung exact time or time frame na bago siya magiging available for consumption or utilization. Kasi akala nila pag meron na, uy, may vaccine na, meron ng cure agad-agad. O, bili na tayo, sige, pa-vaccine na tayo. So, paano ba yung, was the waiting period?
Well, we can only do assumptions, no? Pero ako may experience naman ako. If we talk about the Solidarity vaccine trial, maybe we are talking of maybe first quarter of next year because it
Okay.
still has to start. So usually in 3 months, they would be able to come up with preliminary data. And if the preliminary data was sufficient enough to establish the safety and efficacy, then probably we can already purchase the vaccine. And for those who are what we call the independent trials, those that are sponsored, no, by pharmaceuticals, it may last uh, for 1 year at the minimum. And they are
Oh,
also about to start only. So next year, late next year pa yan.
late next year, meaning at the end of the year in 2021. That's how long a
Yeah.
time people have to wait.
Yes, unless if our Food and Drug Administration, because depending on the situation on COVID in the country, if it's still high and the FDA sees that we have no more time to wait for the local clinical trials, we can already adapt what's available in other country. But
Mhm.
again, it will
Mhm.
have to be very carefully assessed and decided on by FDA and the Department of Health.
And
Because
it's going,
the vaccines right now, like the leading ones, the Moderna and
mm,
the
mm,
AstraZeneca vaccine, is
mm,
almost about to finish their phase 3 trial. So they
mhm.
will be the one to be available already.
And it's going to be real expensive, right?
Yes,
Oh,
expensive. Yeah.
oh. So habang hinihintay natin yon, yung reminders din yung dalawa na, uh, yun, kailangan sundin pa yung health protocols pa rin. We should take care of ourselves so that others can also take care of themselves, so that we all can take care of ourselves and then survive and live another day, right? Di ba?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Ito na yung medyo introspection our part as media practitioners. Kayo, you're not only doctors, you've been relying on information from the media. Kung ano man yung favorite station ninyo or newspaper, wala kang pangalan. Pero, pero ano yung observation ninyo na sa mga reports namin? Too critical or kulang ba scientifically? Walang, ang laman ba ng mga reports namin or yung mga storya, kulang ba sa explanation scientifically so that they can be understood by the reading public or by those in the social media?
Actually, ang na-o-observe ko kung minsan, yun nga may kasalanan din kasi mga doctors, no? Minsan nahihirapan
Alam
kayong
ko kami.
i-balance.
Oh, okay.
Nahihirapan kayong i-balance kasi both sides eh. And
Okay.
usually, ang mas active magpa-interview, minsan yun pa yung merong information na incorrect or not scientifically sound, no? So sometimes yun ang nai-interview. And of course,
Oo.
naiintindihan namin yan. Actually, yun ang great moral lesson sa Ding Baksha, which I learned
Mm.
personally. No, when we had a media conference, sinasabi nga namin, bakit ganun? Lagi nyo ini-interview yung ganyan, yung ganyan. Minsan nagpo-post pa na expert doon. And minsan nagiging mainstay pa. Di ba?
Mm.
Sa
Oo,
radio
oo,
station. And
oo.
what did the media said? The media said, kasi ang hirap-hirap nyo naman hagilapin. Invite interview, pwede ba bukas na? Pwede
Mm.
ba sa
Oo,
ganito?
oo.
What happens? Nag-pass na yung story.
Oo. Yeah.
You are left with just presenting what you have.
Oo. Oo.
It's not your fault. So, yun talaga ang great moral lesson. And isa rin yan sa advocacy dapat namin mga doktor. Dapat ma-accept ng mga doctors when a media personnel approaches them and they know something, they know an accurate information, and they're being asked to talk about it, they should grab the opportunity.
Yeah.
Otherwise,
Oo.
everything will be lost.
Correct. Yes,
Yeah.
going back to what you said about accessibility and also the constant dialogue, especially now, vis-a-vis educating the public, di ba? Itong ganitong klaseng crisis or pandemya na hindi maintindihan at this point na pang 8 months na tayo ng quarantine and hopefully when things get better, mas lalo pa nating maintindihan hindsight na yun pala yung nangyari. But going back to what I said also kanina when I introduced you, na I think it is about also the time to look into our functions as content providers, as journalists, as media practitioners, as academics, in one collective community na tulong-tulong tayo in making this whole information accessible and also understandable for public consumption, right? So, yun, communication pa rin yung nag-uusapan nandito. Okay, meron pa ba tayong questions from our audience? Medyo naintindihan kasi nilaymanize ng ating mga doctors na mas lalo kung naintindihan ko na a deepening, a refreshing journey, of course, although 2 hours lang to, that's the limitation of the platform right now. But if there are no questions from the audience, from our Dexter is a trustee representing Luzon. He is a journalist in Baguio, based in Baguio. So kung wala na po, I hope you just can Google Doc Teen and Doc Ed on Facebook, wherever. I hope they're accessible. They're just out there. Maraming salamat to both of you for really finding yourselves in this kind of platform. We pursued this kasi we thought that this is really very important in terms of not only educating us media practitioners, pero putting out there that vital information that everyone has a stake. Everyone has a stake in educating people and also bridging gaps and building better understanding so that we can build better communities, your community, health community doctors as well. I thank you for this. Sana mas marami pang katulad nyo na accessible and also are too willing to be interviewed. Dexter, pwede mo na ma-interview sila Doc Ting and Doc Ed. So, any parting words for both of you before we sign off? And I call this a wrap. Yes. Any parting words from both of you?
Ako na. As a parting word,
No.
I think no, history has taught us that the media and the medical people has been working talaga together to get rid of pandemics, to offer solutions to problems, and I think we should pursue that relationship in a more enlightened way, na maintindihan natin na, uy, partners pala tayo dati pa, ngayon ko lang nalaman. And we should work together in improving that relationship kasi we can really make a lot of changes in the public health system in our country, knowing how poor it is, how very little budget is given to public health. And I think us being together and recognizing now this relationship we have can bring more change in our society.
True. Perfect. Well said. Doc Ed?
Well, short lang siguro. We are in different worlds but there's no reason para hindi tayo magkaintindihan. We
Absolutely.
should work together. There's no reason para hindi tayo mag-agree that we have both critical roles in shaping this society.
Correct.
Yes.
After all, both our functions are public service, right?
Yes.
Public service. Maraming salamat po for all those who want to have a peek of the doctor's presentations. If they allow, we will be posting them in the PPI website. PPI, I'm plugging na ito. All you guys, there are two PPI websites. It's www.fieldpressinstitute.net for general information about our programs and activities in the PPI. And there's another one, it's a www.ppinewscommons.net. Kayo po, Doc Ed and Doc Tina, you can also visit that website, ppi.newscommons.net, for all narratives or for a lot of narratives and stories about COVID-19 produced and written by journalists, mostly community journalists. So, yun po yung isang website namin about COVID-19. COVID-19. It's called COVID-19 Chronicles. So, siguro kailangan din ng mga academics na bisitahin din yung namin, yung website namin. And I think doctors as well can also visit our website. So, maraming salamat po ulit to the both of you, power couple. Power couple ngayon, no? Itong na to, platform na to. Really, thank you very much for that enlightening presentation and To all of you watching via FB live streaming and in the meeting room, we'll see you again in our next edition of our webinar. Maraming salamat po. Keep safe, everyone. Let's hope and pray for better things to come. Maraming salamat po. Have a nice day. Take care of your family. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Pretty good.